United States made some big mistakes during that period. So my experiences were like packed in this short period of time, but it was very, very widespread. It was the Vietnam War, and I had been to Santo Domingo with the conflict there in '65 briefly, and then back to Vietnam for the Tet Offensive in '68, after being sent to quell a rise in Detroit in 1967 with the 82nd Airborne Division. That opened my eyes to a lot and educated me to a lot. At the time, I'm 19 years old, 18, 19 years old. The government made this big mistake of sending an outfit who had just come from Vietnam and who was like 60, maybe to 70% black. It was a huge mistake that the Pentagon had made in sending us to quell a riot in 1967. And within days after coming from Vietnam, and all of us were largely, primarily, we were combat vets. And so it was funny because it was a big party. Everybody in the community came and was glad to see us, because they know we supported what they were fighting for. So it turned out to be kind of a tit-for-tat thing with the Michigan National Guard and the various predominantly white forces that were sent in to quell the black rioters. And at some point, I think it was about a week and a half later, they realized the mistake they made and they pulled us all out. And the next thing you know, we were put on the transports back to Vietnam as a punishment for losing so many weapons and munitions while we were in Detroit.
Feeling is broad all over. It's 1968. I'm getting out of the service. And then I begin to draw what I was about to say, the most important thing, the parallels. I go through Watts. I go through Chicago. I go through Harlem. And I see that the people in the what's called the ghetto, the black communities or the colonies or whatever you want to call it, were treated almost exactly the way we just got through treating Viet Cong or Vietnamese people in Vietnam. So I begin to draw parallels that the police departments in these various situations in these cities were actually the same thing we were in Vietnam, occupying forces. They didn't live in the communities. They came from another area. They didn't know the inhabitants of that community. So, and they were exploiting, they were imprisoning, killing, a lot of killing, just blacks at random, and it's still happening today. So you begin to draw those parallels and see that these police, who sent them in here? What are they doing? They're getting all this money. They're coming from the suburbs somewhere, killing people, putting people in prison, getting criminal records and whatnot, setting up entrapment. So, excuse me, like Steve Biko used to say, so they can look good for their bosses. They have to create situations to justify keeping their jobs. If nothing really is happening, they have to make something happen so they can get that paycheck. And the black community is victimized. My people victimized, but, and so it had a very strong effect that I had to stand up. The fellas, though, it was incumbent upon me to stand up and strike out against these things, to stand and to resist these things. And that was one of the main motivations that propelled me into the movement back then, coming from Vietnam. Like I said, told you, I'm raised in the South, and these things had existed prior to Vietnam. So Vietnam enhanced a lot of things, and I became wiser to a lot of situations. But one of the things that when you ask yourself, okay, I want to help, they're doing their wrong. These dirty motherfuckers, what can you do to help? Okay, you have these skills, you have these skills. And when you draw back upon your skills, well, I could help feed children. I got a car. I could help with transportation as I'm studying, right? And then, for instance, this example of the helicopter hovering above with the bull laying and the blacks, and the police cars got the blacks laying on it, about 4 or 5 blacks laying on the ground, on their stomachs, with their hands cuffed behind their backs, and the very same thing. The helicopter it was almost an identical scene that had happened many times in Vietnam. But the only difference, instead of black, you had Vietnamese. Uh, and then the people who were killed, like trying to prevent these police from doing this in the community, these pigs, that's why they were called pigs, from coming exploiting the community, were just outnumbered. They were outmatched. They were outclassed. Most of them didn't even know how to load a weapon and stuff. So I saw where I had this knowledge, even before the army, we knew about weaponry and stuff. So I was able to help educate them to that, which alarmed, oh, well, you taught weapons, you goddamn right, and I'll teach it again. I'll teach them, we have, sure, these people are killing our people. And there's nothing wrong with that. If you find something wrong, that's your problem. We could deal with that. But these people are not going to go out here on these streets trying to protect their families and be killed because they don't know the right side of a weapon. They're going to know at least this much how to defend themselves and help them with that. So I felt good about doing that. But most of the contributions that I was able to make had came from the way I was brought up and the things that I had been exposed to. The military aspect that I had learned from the Army, coupled with what I had learned from coming up hunting, in Louisiana stuff.
All right, welcome to another edition of Millennials Are Killing Capitalism Live. That is a clip of Geronimo Gijaga Pratt. And again, this is a contribution from the Freedom Archives, who are going to be our guests for today's show. And very much looking forward to this discussion today. Obviously, it is an important day in radical and revolutionary history. Today is May 19th. Which I'm sure, as you all know, today is the 100th birthday. Essentially, Malcolm X would be 100 years old today. And it's also the birthday of Ho Chi Minh. It's also the birthday of Kathy Boudin. It's also, I like to bring up Lorraine Hansberry because even though, she may not be, Malcolm or Ho Chi Minh, or Yuri Kochiyama as well. Most people know Lorraine Hansberry as the playwright from The Raisin in the Sun, but she was also a radical journalist who wrote for Paul Robeson's newspaper Freedom and did a lot of, anti-imperialists, traveling the world and organizing and activism and wrote about it for that newspaper. And then, of course, there's the May 19th Communist Organization, which took its name also from the state because of folks like Ho Chi Minh and Malcolm X and Yuri Kochiyama. And I just want to shout out earlier today on Black Liberation Media, there was a great episode for Malcolm X's 100th birthday. It featured Orasami Burton. It featured Hiram Rivera, both of whom are great guests, and also some different, kind of archival footage and, different conversations. So definitely encourage people to check that out. If you missed it this morning, it was excellent. And today's conversation, we're not going to do, so today is not a May 19th conversation. It's just a conversation that we're having on May 19th and a fitting one at that. And we're going to be talking with some folks who do amazing work, maintaining a revolutionary archive or, an archive of liberation movements of all kinds. And I'm sure that they will talk about a lot of that work and the movements that are included in it and what it looks like. One of the ways it looks is the clip that you all just watched, which we'll put all of those in the show description after the show. We're going to show a few of them through this conversation, but there are other ways it looks as well. And so our guests today are Claude Marks, who is the co-director and co-founder of the Freedom Archives. He's been with it since its establishment in 1999. He is a former U.S.-held political prisoner and lifelong activist. He was a documentary producer, reporter, and production director at KPFA-FM in Berkeley in the late 60s and early 70s. You can read his full bio in the show description. And Nathaniel Moore is an archivist and co-director at the Freedom Archives. He has been active in prisoner support work for the past decade and is the co-founder of an education program focusing on social justice inside San Quentin Prison. And Noah Tesfaye is a researcher and organizer based in the Bay Area. His work focuses on the political philosophy of the Republic of New Africa and the New African Independence Movement, particularly its relationship to contemporary organizing around self-determination for Black people in the United States. So I'm going to welcome our guests to the stage now. So Claude, Nathaniel, and Noah, thanks for joining us today for this discussion. It's great to be with you all. As I welcome you to the stage, why don't you take just a quick moment and maybe share a little bit more about yourself, and maybe, you know, since you already shared a little bit about the work that you do, or maybe some of the parts of the at Freedom Archive that you kind of specifically focus on. Claude, do you want to start us off? We'll kind of go clockwise, I guess.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity to join you and talk a little bit about our work, but more importantly, you know, you contextualize this in relationship to the date, the prominence of May 19th, which is totally on the mark. We're also in very challenging period of time and struggle in the world, given the attempt to wipe out the Palestinian people. And we need to frame our thinking and our daily existence in the context of what opportunities we have to struggle against genocide and to support the resistance in Palestine. So having said that, the work of the Freedom Archives has always been dedicated to the voices that are normally subjugated, that are targeted for elimination because of their resistance, particularly to settler colonialism, and the growth of capitalism and imperialism in the world. And so as a program producer, when I came to it at the age of 18, it's always been this kind of combined joy on one hand and kind of a necessity to step up and beyond in order to articulate and give voice to the politics of opposition, of resistance to oppression, of liberation in all of its senses. So what that allowed us to do in our youth was to accumulate a body of work, and to add to it, because none of us functioned as individuals, but functioned as part of a collective process of collectives, plural, in process. And the nature of the programming that we did in the late 60s and early 70s, even at the moment, was marginalized, not valued. On the other hand, what that meant is that even without understanding it at the moment, we kept the product of our work, even though the people who broadcasted didn't value it enough to want to archive it. And so fast forward many years, the core of materials, which is only a small part of what we now have in the archive, is a reflection of a collective effort in many communities to represent opposition, resistance, and liberation. And so the fact that we exist is a way of uplifting that, but also in seeing ourselves in an ongoing context in which, you know, these struggles exist apart from ourselves as even collectives, and that a movement to be healthy needs to be able to access its own roots so that we're firmly both inspired by and informed by the struggles that precede us. And it's for that reason that we can show you Geronimo Gijaga shortly after getting out of prison, and the first clip closer to, his leaving us. And that becomes very important. What he said about Vietnam, and we just celebrated the 50th anniversary of the victory of the Vietnamese people's war against U.S. imperialism. No small thing, something that isn't emphasized or taught much in terms of public education, because the U.S. wants people to not understand that the capacity of an organized struggle on a very basic level can in fact win against the largest political and military force in any given period. And so the fact that the Vietnamese were able to accomplish that contextualizes the current struggle in Palestine, in the African continent, in Latin America, in Asia, because despite marginalizing the history, they haven't been able to destroy the actual resistance and capacity of people to continue to organize. So the archive wants to not just reflect that, but make that resource, that body of material available for repurposing, not to control it so much, but to say that, we have these roots to various struggles, and you can draw upon them in the work that is currently going on.
Yeah, a beautiful way to start us off. Thank you, Nathaniel. Yeah, sorry to make you go after Claude.
Well, good thing for us. We've known each other for a long time, so this won't be the first or last time. It's all good. I would echo Claude. Thanks for having us on, and excited to be a part of this conversation. My name is Nathaniel. I'm another of the co-directors at the Freedom Archives, and I also function as the lead archivist. I'm also, so I'm going to pick up on a couple things that Claude said and then add a little bit about myself. To the point of the collective process, I also just want to take the chance that right now you're talking with two of our staff members and a long-time volunteer, but there is another staff member that we have and a whole bunch of other people who help us do the work that we do. So although they may not be focused on in this interview, certainly they are a huge part of our ability to be able to do all the things we do. So also just want to recognize them. So I came to Freedom Archives 15 years ago. And I think on the inspire and inform, that was a big piece of why I have been here as long as I have and why I'm excited to continue to be here. When I arrived, which was not for the purpose of a job or anything, actually just as a place to volunteer and my own curiosities, I was struck by all the information that despite having a couple different graduate degrees and being pretty intellectually curious throughout my life, all the information that I did not know that was here. And that was a big, that was like really important to me and something that definitely I appreciated and that I noticed was like something that could really kind of ground me in the space. And then I think the inspiration piece was that as someone who was starting to kind of deepen my political engagement from just kind of intellectually thinking about things and kind of making connections and having conversations, but actually trying to develop kind of a more robust practice to kind of accompany that. The Freedom Archives is also very great because in addition to having all of this inspiration built into the archive, just of people who have done this work, there's also the living kind of like palpable energy of the people who are literally there. So whether that be staff members, whether that be other volunteers who come through, other founders, just so many people to engage with and learn from. And so some of those dynamics was kind of, as I engaged the space initially as a volunteer, what excited me. And then it just so happened that I had an archival skill set. And so it was a really nice match. And 15 years later, here I am. And I think that, I've been really, some of what I've appreciated about the Freedom Archives kind of in that totality is both my ability to contribute to the space and watch it grow and, engage with other people here and kind of play a part in that journey, but also to think about in other political work that I do, ability to kind of reflect upon experiences and things that I learn in the Freedom Archives or engage in the Freedom Archives, and how that's also helping to strengthen, again, like my practice and engagement outside of the space. So it's been, really important to me. And some of the things that I do when I'm here, because we're a small staff and a collective, we all tend to do lots of different things, but kind of managing and growing the archive is something that is one of my key focuses. So Claude kind of mentioned the initial iteration of materials that started the Freedom Archives, and now 25 years later, we have so much more stuff. So how do we kind of continue to intake materials and then organize them and make them accessible for folks? So that's a lot of the work I do. I also work a lot with the interns and volunteers, helping them with their own projects and, just kind of providing support when they need it. And then a lot of the project work that we do. One of the things that also I was looking for a space that was not a traditional education space, but a space that still was focused on, educating and specifically education for, the purpose of liberation or empowerment. And so, although a little bit different than a traditional kind of teaching setting, the projects are actually really important to me because it allows me to kind of speak to the importance of education in my own life. And again, I think as Claude said, if we know our own roots of resistance, certainly it allows us to kind of frame what we're going through in a different way and imagine possibilities for how we want to move forward. So I'll leave it there, and I guess I'll pass it to Noah.
Yeah, and to third everyone, obviously, incredibly grateful, Jared, as always, to contribute to the platform. Jared and Josh are good friends, and I appreciate, being able to contribute to a platform that's been so influential and central to my political development. So as always, I really appreciate the chance to be here with y'all. So I came to the archive similar to Nathaniel in early, I want to say mid 2021. I was doing some research on the Republic of New Africa, which ended up, fleshing out further into like my undergraduate research. And the funny thing that in hindsight, I'm like, now I understand the process behind it was anytime I would look for documents specifically related to the RNA, the archives was the first thing to pop up. I would later learn that's because we catalog on an item by item level, which allows us, fortunately, due to how search engines are optimized, we end up popping up pretty early in a lot of your queries around, Black Panther Party, Black Liberation Army, other formations and movements and histories as well. And then I realized that the archives was actually like close to me growing up in the Bay. And so I was like, okay, cool. So I did my first in-person visit back when the archives used to be in the Mission in San Francisco. And that was my first of many archival visits to, begin to flesh out my research. And then kind of loosely stayed in touch with Nathaniel over time. And then about almost 2 years ago, I followed up and was like, hey, I have some, downtime with some medical issues and I'll be in the Bay Area for an indefinite period of time. Is there any way I can contribute and volunteer? And so that's how things kind of got started. I was lucky to get some external funding to be able to be at the archives and be more committed for the past year, which I'm incredibly grateful for. And so generally, like in terms of workload and the types of things I do a little bit of everything from like helping update collection descriptions, intaking, processing new materials we have, helping, meet with people that come and visit. We're working on trying to digitize all of our CD collections because CDs are a degrading file format and that's becoming an issue. So helping trying to figure out those things. and then working on some like OCR processing stuff as well. So it's a little bit of everything, but I think, to echo Nathaniel's point about the biggest reason why, I'm grateful to be able to come to the archive so frequently is because of the people. Like single-handedly, it's been the most formative part of my political development, and I credit that in large part due to the conversations we have when, whether we're eating lunch or we're asking questions around a certain material, or hey, this came up in a prior conversation. And so I think that really helped, greatly in terms of like me understanding what my commitments are, what I care about, what I value, what's important to me, and to the organizing I do, and thinking about how to bring the materials of the archives into the work we're doing, and into the research as well. So yeah.
Awesome. Thank you all for those reflections. And yeah, Noah, it's great to see you in this context. Many folks who've been a part of the millennial study groups will, of course, remember you. I see some folks recognizing you in the chat from that, of course. So we're going to talk about, kind of more of the work that you all are doing throughout this conversation. We're going to share a few clips, talk about some of the projects that you all have done with Freedom Archives, because obviously you do. There's a, as you just kind of laid out, there's a range of work that you do. And one of the things that you do is create, take archival material, or take, to use a Sonia Vaz Borges term, walking archives, or people who have, so much kind of experience from struggle, like that clip from Geronimo Jijaga at the beginning, and, create documentaries, create things like that. And so we'll talk about some of that different stuff. But why don't we start a little bit, and Claude, you'll probably lead us off here again because you were there, to talk a little bit about the founding of Freedom Archives. And then, for all of you, kind of what you see as the role of it today. I know we've touched on that already, but if there's, additional comments you have on that point.
Well, I'll tell an abbreviated story, which is essentially that one of the things that I was able to do when I was imprisoned was to reconnect with people after, many years of clandestine stuff. And in doing that, I came to realize that people had taken responsibility for hanging on to what was mainly audio, but some video materials from the 60s and 70s. And I mean, it just seemed so important to think about how do we repurpose that and respect the value that it's not just the work, but the voices, the culture, the documentation. And so in starting to network, it became clear that we had the potential of doing that. And so after I got out of prison, we really were able to sit down and kind of rekindle a lot of old friendships and working relationships, but more importantly, trigger conversations about envisioning what a project would look like, giving it a name, and starting in on that work of like, what do we have? How do we start unboxing this material? What does it take to actually identify what we have and what its context is? And for me, also learning what a computer was, and how do you start to create something that becomes more of a public resource rather than just a cool collection of stuff. And so that's really its genesis. And in doing that, close to a dozen people came back together. For all of us, it was an opportunity to kind of give it some shape and to raise some resources, to give it a physical location, which was initially a storage closet that we rented for $60 a month in an old movement building in the Mission District in San Francisco. And once we were able to do that, it just, the work continued to develop over what's now 25 years.
That's amazing. That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, Noah or Nathaniel, do you want to add a little bit about what you see as the role today of Freedom Archives? I mean, as Claude led us off early in this conversation, obviously now is a time where, movement's always important, but with what's going on in Palestine and Gaza and, other struggles, around the world and in the United States, what do you see as the role of the Freedom Archives in that?
We'll keep this order for one more go around and then we'll change it up. I think that I think a lot of this has been said in different kind of ways. So my goal for this will just be to say a couple different pieces. And I think that some of this is more of a consequence of how I see things today through my 15 years here. So it'll be a little bit different than when I first walked in the doors. One thing, so, there's kind of like the obvious, like whether or not history repeats itself, it certainly rhymes. So there's kind of like that just general umbrella why these things are important. And I think the more rooted in struggle and resistance that we are, the easier it comes and the more logical developing that muscle seems. So I think those are two things that are important. But I also kind of think about there's another piece of this at this moment is what is now in our society, like, I don't want to say a newfound focus because I don't know that that's how I see the world, but certainly there is a renewed focus on archives, left history, these kinds of things. And so I think that opens a door and creates an opportunity for especially people in our communities to think about ways that we can kind of recenter our role in knowledge production, and that like movements and communities and people create history, not single authors or institutions or whatever. And so I think that creating concentrations of perspectives and narratives and experiences that people can draw from to actually imagine how we can shape our reality and see the world moving forward is important. So the Freedom Archive should not be the only place that does this kind of work, but the more and more places that exist that do this kind of thing, I feel like the stronger our movements will be. And I'd say the last piece is something that also strikes me as important. And so some of this is like, as society now, as information overload exists and things move so fast, sometimes just having space to dive deep into something and engage is a useful practice to disrupt what is now more of kind of a superficial and fast moving pace through all things. And for the people who do this work, the Freedom Archives provide some interesting models for different ways that community archives could function, or that people who are interested in preserving this kind of history or work, how they might want to go at it to best be grounded in communities, so to best like and more accurately represent those communities or be in solidarity with those communities, or create platforms where those communities don't even need LIS professionals to represent them, they can just represent themselves. So I don't know that I was thinking about all those things when I first came into Freedom Archives, but I think especially now as like society has certainly changed in the past 15 years, that like I think that some of these things also now create new opportunities for us to continue the type of work we do that maybe weren't foreseen as the original goals of the space.
Yeah, right on. I mean, Noah, you're the youngest generation that's encountering this space, and you're encountering it as you're also getting your your feet wet into organizing, as well as balancing that with your academic pursuits that are also connected to radical and revolutionary history. So what do you see as the role of it today?
I think I think I didn't realize how little I knew about anything movement related until I started volunteering regularly. And I think it was the best like wake up for me, in large part because I think in many ways it's an immense like privilege to be able to just, spend as much time as I have the last year and a half, almost 2 years, to just think, right? And I think that given, the various constraints around movement politics around, oh, we have to respond to everything, oh, we have to constantly be on top of the news again and again and again. There is something to be said for allowing, whether it's certain comrades in your organization or like time to collectively take a step back and a pause and be like, okay, like what have we actually tried, and what has worked, what hasn't worked, what are the limitations of that, right? And so in terms of thinking very strategically around what are the specifics of like what it is organizers want to build, right? If I'm talking about the Black Panther Party, what chapter, which people, which part of the country, right? Like you have to ask those very specific questions to be able to get a better sense of, okay, based on that, a certain tactic was effective or not effective. And for me, being in an archive space, thinking about like what those implications are for the organizing I'm doing, as well as for the research, which is directly linked to the organizing I'm doing, and trying to figure out these kinds of questions around what does it mean for us to commit to more substantive like political struggle, right? It's like, I think taking the time, right, to one, have like a sense of humility, right? That like, yeah, we may have not been successful in implementing this particular thing, or we may have come short on this other aspect, right? But that level of like humility for, I think, people my age in particular is really important, because when you spend all the time you do engaging and combing through archives like our collections, right? There's a level of like, oh, I haven't tried anything yet, right? Like I have so much left to like think through, and not in a way that's intimidating, but it is a way to be like, I have so much to learn, or we have so much to learn. Therefore, we should think about ways to incorporate how we think about the past to inform our present in a very like material and tangible way.
Awesome. Thank you. So we're going to get into projects in a minute, but I'm going to go ahead and play another clip here just so that we can take a quick pause, and we'll be right back, folks. So just stay tuned as I work this out real quick.
When we got to Cuba, Robert wanted to and told everybody his fight was not in Cuba, his fight was in the United States. So he wanted to establish a radio program. He came up with this idea, he was listening to Voice of America and heard all of the good stuff they were talking about. And he said, we should establish a radio program. And so he went, he presented the idea to Fidel Castro. Well, Fidel said, okay, and told some of the people, help Williams, he knows what he's doing, help him to get his radio program. And of course, that we got a good political education at the time too, because there were people who said that the struggle that we were leading and the role that we were playing was going to divide the working class in the United States. So a lot of people didn't want to see us have a radio program. Or if we had one, they wanted to say what could be said on it. And Robert insisted, well, no, if I'm going to have a radio program, I'll have to make the decision as what to be said on the radio program. So that's, we had a political struggle, but Fidel Castro finally went to Radio Progreso and said, do I have to come down here and put Williams on the radio? He didn't have to come after then. They gave us this radio program and we had broadcast 3 days a week. We made a tape on Monday and then it was played Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And Rob did all of his own editorials. People sent us news clippings, newspapers, and I read the news of what was going on in the civil rights struggle in the United States and tried to let other people know what was going on.
All right, that was Mabel Williams. All right. Great clip, great clip. So let's talk a little bit about some of kind of the challenges of a movement archive. And, I really kind of wanted to pick your all brain about your collective brain, your brains, about something that, I've had some discussions about counterinsurgency with folks, and we've thought about, the fact that sometimes when you read counterinsurgents, one of the things that comes into your mind as you're reading it is like, wow, these people are actually really studying the left, and probably not to the depth that you could study the left in Freedom Archives, but they're reading, Che Guevara, they're reading Mao, they're reading this stuff, and they're developing counter theories based off of what they're reading. And interestingly, you go to Rand Corporation, right, or these other places, and they're also sifting through academic literature, stuff anthropologists are writing, stuff sociologists are writing. And so this is like one issue that I see as like one potential like challenge or, thing to navigate is, okay, we're maintaining an archive, but we want to make sure that it's an archive for the movement, right? And so that's on one hand. But the other hand, and this is something, Nathaniel, that you helped me think about as we were talking about, a few weeks ago, is that being too concerned with that, leaves it wide open to the problem that, Claude was confronted with in the beginning, which is that if we don't archive this for the movement, then it could be lost entirely. And, this is a major issue on the left as well, as this lack of institutional memory, this lack of places to go to be able to access what came before, to be able to like learn from those lessons. And so I'm just curious, kind of, as what do you see as, important challenges or opportunities or kind of threats here as folks archiving this work and trying to ensure that you navigate these issues with some fidelity and think about them, but don't come down on the wrong side of them, I guess. And maybe Noah, since we've been going the other way, we could start with you and work our way back to Claude on this one.
Yeah, I mean, these are just in line also with conversations we've had at the archives over the last couple months. I think in large part because as someone that's like new, obviously, to like being in an archive and like spending this much time in an archive, particularly a community and a movement driven archive, right, where everyone that is and spends time in the archives for the most part has very clear like political commitments or part of various different organizations or have supported, political prisoner campaigns, especially, right? We all kind of are thinking about like how counterinsurgency is something that like should remain like in mind. And to the point, but I would also say that, if you wanted like certain movement histories and you were that concerned about those things, you could just go to the Hoover Institute, which is like an hour drive south. But I think what's unique about how we approach it, right, is that like because of the people that like co-founded the archives, we're entrusted with certain materials that other places just will not have access to. And so in terms of like thinking about what it means to like build an institution that has that kind of support and buy-in from revolutionaries, former political prisoners, etc. There needs to be that like intimate like interpersonal relationship or comradeship to make those things stick, and that's not something you can really that any one part of U.S. military forces, as much as they might try to, can get in the way of. And so I think that that's kind of at least one of the biggest things I've realized in my time at the archives is that like as much as yes, those things are informing, like how we think about stuff. I would also say on the flip side, focusing more on like why we just need to preserve these materials, right? Like at this point, and we don't like outside of certain movement archives, there isn't like a movement wide interest or like desire to even preserve our own internal organizational files or materials, right? And so what does it mean to actually take those things seriously, to take our materials seriously, to take our histories seriously, if we're not going to do anything to preserve them? And so I think that like demanding more of that rather than at least solely while being cognizant of the counterinsurgent kind of forces at play that want to, house those archives for themselves and not have them accessible to us is something important for sure.
Yeah, thank
This
you.
is a good and big question. So I'll chip away at parts knowing that both Claude's coming up next, as well as, there'll just be additional opportunities to talk and get certain things in. I think one of the things I would say is I don't know that there's a template to do this. And I think that our confidence that there's not a template to do it gives us the space to make thoughtful and informed and deliberate decisions and not fall into a more kind of like transactional, like we got a request, so we have to respond, and they want to use this, so we have to say yes, and which is one of the fallacies of kind of librarianship of just like, any and every request is the same, and like you just have to, respond to the requests, and it doesn't matter if it's from the FBI or a movement filmmaker. It's it's both a request, right? So, and that kind of leads us to neutrality, which is like we see ourselves. We are not a neutral place. We're not we don't. We have ideas. We opened with the dignity of Palestinians, right? So we don't think that. So not only do we not think that there's a template for how we have to do any of this work, but we also don't assume that we have to participate or in a two-sided, if we want to raise the opinions of the Black liberation movement, we also have to raise the opinions of white supremacy. So we can have a balanced, thing, and you can decide, right? So avoiding some of those things, I think, has been helpful to us, both in terms of us having legitimacy within our own movements, and also helping us avoid getting into some of these sticky situations where, we're bumping up against these state forces. I would say one other thing that I think is important, and this has been raised many times, but it is existence in a larger community. And so one of the number one things that we do is we're constantly in contact with other archives, other political projects, other organizations, other people. And so very rarely are we trying to make any decision in a vacuum. We're trying to make it as collective as possible. And the reason why we're doing that is so that we can be assured that we're stewarding the materials in a way that is actually responsive to the communities and people we are accountable to, which is the movement and those people who gave us the things. So that does not mean that, if one functions as an archive, people are going to contact you to use things. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we can avoid some of these challenges, unfortunately not. But I think by centering some of the things that I just said as like a precursor to making any decision, those are some of the kind of strategies that have helped us, really kind of develop a practice which is pretty grounded in like accountability, communication, and, stewardship on the side of our movements, and not just on the side of anybody who wants to engage.
I think that's a really helpful way to frame it. And I'm glad, Nathaniel, that you brought up this kind of myth of, neutrality and balance. I mean, you can turn on, PBS and they call themselves, neutral and balanced and fair, but in reality, they're reflecting the same interests of the state, just a slightly softer version of it. For us, we've also chosen over the last 25 years to actually produce materials that uplift certain aspects of our holdings. And we've always done it with a sense of, what is strategic in any given period. So we created a fairly short video called Legacy of Torture to speak to the history of repression and violence against the Black Liberation Movement, more specifically the Black Panther Party, which was released the week of charges coming down against a number of former members of the Black Panther Party who were all in their 60s and 70s, with the idea on the part of the state of recriminalizing that history and increasing the number of political conscious activist Black forces in the prison. And the reason the timing was so prescient was because we were part of a process of doing organizing work that was rooted in understanding, on one hand, the interests of the state, and post 9/11, the character and nature of how they were going to move, the kind of oppression that the movements that we're connected to are going to be faced with, and a level of work that during the grand jury phase of that attack against the Panthers was at the same time dealing with the Green Scare, the newer kinds of organizers that were also engaged. And I'm not trying to equate the politics as much as to say that the consistent nature of oppression on the part of the state and our understanding of that is what led us to want to make this film. In the same sense as we made a film about the counterinsurgency program of the FBI and the way that it impacted not just Black liberation, but Puerto Rican independence movement, the land back indigenous struggles. The American Indian movement was targeted in heavy ways. There were death squads that were functioning against all these struggles. What was called the Chicano-Mexicano movement as it emerged, and the repression that it was faced with. And so in making a film to try to teach about the strategy of the state towards oppositional struggle, we were creating a way of both building resistance and educating people. And I mean, it's not surprising that when we look at the statistics of the material that we have on our Vimeo site over the last months, clearly the viewing of COINTELPRO 101, which you can do for free, is the most observed video that we have. I mean, it's a good thing. And so something that we created in 2011 is still vital to understanding the core of what we're experiencing in terms of the repression today. I mean, yes, it has new facets, but it's consistent. And in the film COINTELPRO 101, we talk about settler colonialism. We talk about, the modern version of violence towards these movements is part of the continuity of genocide against indigenous people, of enslavement, of imperial expansion in the case of Mexico, and the ongoing colonization of Puerto Rico. So if we see ourselves as part of that, it also directs and gives, a level of importance to the choices that we make in any given period of time in terms of what to uplift. And so we are continuing that process, and we see ourselves not as apart from, but really as an integral part of the struggles that the movement is expressing, why people are organizing, how we need to understand the nature of imperialism in a period like this.
Awesome. I'm going to play an audio clip, and I just want to highlight something you just said there, Claude, too, which is that, all this material is freely available to folks. And we will put the links in the show description, but, you have a Vimeo page, you have a Bandcamp. And so the clips that we are playing are not just ones that, you sent me for special use from the archive, but ones that people can access online, as well as a bunch of scanned print material and things like that too. So I'm going to play this now, and then we'll talk a little bit about your work with the Puerto Rican independence movement, because I know that you also have a documentary you're working on this as well.
This is the chamber of the House of Representatives within a few moments after it was emptied, still showing the aftermath of the wild hail of bullets by fanatic Puerto Rican nationalists. Outside the Capitol, hospital and emergency units quickly mobilized to care for the 5 wounded congressmen cut down in the fantastic sudden shooting. Even as the stricken 5 are rushed away to hospitals, observers regarded a miracle that more were not hurt in the crowded chamber by maniacs firing at close range. Under heavy guard are the would-be assassins, Mrs. Lolita Lebrun, who boldly claims she's instigator of the murder plot. Seized with her in the visitors' gallery, Andrew Carderos. Another who brazenly sprayed bullets an unsuspecting congressman is Rafael Miranda. A 4th member of their group evaded capture in the House chamber. He's Irving Flores, arrested soon after the attack in a Washington bus terminal.
Mr. Gandhi, do you agree that the way to gain independence for Puerto Rico is to go around shooting American congressmen?
The nationalist movement of Puerto Rico is a movement that for many than 25 years has been demanded in all international congresses and all international bodies the recognition of independence of Puerto Rico.
Did you shoot to kill the persons in the Congress?
Not to kill.
What was the purpose of this shooting?
Purpose of the shooting was in a clamor of freedom for my country.
Well, miss, can you tell us whose idea this was?
It's my idea and our idea, 4 of us idea.
Are you sorry that you shot these 5 congressmen?
I'm not sorry of what I did. I'm not sorry.
How about you, Miss LeBron?
I'm not sorry to come and ask freedom for my country any place.
Luchando por sus derechos, hoy el pueblo se levanta, mientras por allá en Kansas hay 5 nacionalistas presos.
But Lolita looked at the moon on hot nights from her tenement roof. Puerto Rico had to be free. It could not bear the disgrace of being a colony. Lolita and her comrades wanted their country free and independent, an old dream of all the patriots and martyrs. And like them, she thought her life was not too great to give for la causa. They wanted the American people to know that Puerto Ricans want their independence.
Están 5 compañeros presos.
No es fácil pronunciar un discurso cuando tenemos la madre tendida sobre el lecho y en acecho de su vida un asesino. Tal es la situación de presente de nuestra patria, nuestra madre, Puerto Rico. El asesino es el poder.
Condenado por el mero hecho de defender esta tierra, por amarla, por quererla. Hay 5 hermanos presos.
And if you study the acts of violence committed by nationalists, you will find that they have always been within that framework. Resistance against the police who had been ordered to annihilate the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party, to liquidate it, and if necessary, to assassinate its leadership. An attack on the home of President Truman, who had sent Lewis Johnson to Puerto Rico to order the liquidation of the Nationalist Party and assassination of its leadership. And finally, in 1954, an attack on the United States Congress, which must be considered responsible for whatever happens in Puerto Rico because it has usurped Puerto Rico's control over itself. People who consider it dishonorable not to reply when attacked.
Nosotros los puertorriqueños y todos los oprimidos por el terror y la violencia hemos tenido que acudir y no vacilará Puerto Rico si necesario fuera a este último recurso de las nacionalidades, que es el uso de las armas para realizar su emancipación nacional. El imperio norteamericano se obstina en su ocupación de nuestro país y nos provoca día a día y noche a noche a la defensa de nuestra dignidad nacional. Somos víctimas de su violencia y de su terror. Nosotros hemos tratado todos los medios pacíficos en cuyo proceso el enemigo norteamericano se ha fortalecido.
All right. That was great. So why don't you all just, I want to talk about some of the projects and some of the ways people can, also different ways that people can access or also get involved or visit and those kind of things. But why don't we talk a little bit about projects for a minute? So maybe say a little bit, I know there's a Puerto Rico project that you're working on. I know that there's some connection to the book of documents of Robert and Mabel Williams. And so just talk a little bit about some of the stuff that you have going on currently. And then if you want to bring up prior ones that you're really, encourage people to check out, that's fine as well. But yeah, let's talk a little about the project work. Noah, go ahead and lead us off.
Okay, I can be a little bit brief. I guess I can speak a little to the Mabel and Robert Williams stuff just because I digitized most of all of the CD collections we have of Robert and Mabel at the archives, which should hopefully be up on the site by the time the book comes out, which I know it's slowly coming out into the world. But yeah, so there's been, I forgot the all of the co-authors. I know John Bracey, Baba Akinyele Umoja, and a few other folks helped contribute on this edited works. But how I came to the project was because Claude and one of the co-founders and one of his comrades, Lincoln Bergman, were doing interviews with Mabel. And we have those interviews with Mabel kind of documenting her early time organizing, and then also their travels abroad to Cuba and China as well. And so we've been kind of processing and supporting the digitization of the materials related to that that have now made it into the memoir book that University of North Carolina Press is putting out. But I'll defer to Claude more about those details. But I'm excited about that.
Claude, do you want Puerto Rico or you Williams?
Let me just add a little bit about the book.
Yeah, that's what's up.
And then we can transition to the film, and you can take it. So this is a joint memoir that's coming out in June, published by the University of North Carolina. And as Noah mentioned, the editorial process was John Bracey, Akanyele Omoja, and Gloria House. Robert Williams had written a memoir that had never been published, so we were able to dig into that. And Mabel Williams had started the process of writing a memoir, but it was cut short by health challenges. So ultimately, the oral history process that we initiated in 2003 became really the rich core of what ended up being Mabel Williams's part of the memoir. We also did an audio documentary that is available on Bandcamp, either as a CD or as a download, based on essentially the voices of Robert and Mabel, a lot of which draws from Radio Free Dixie, which is the broadcast that Mabel refers to in an event that we did here in Oakland to mark the release of the audio CD that we worked on with her and the family. And so that's the context in which all of this happens. And while it's taken some time to bring it forward, there's something very significant politically and historically about the history of armed self-defense. People have written about it. Akanyele Omoja has written about it. There's many sources of materials available, but this book is really the voice of Robert and Mabel in their own writing. And so we're really looking forward to events that will take place over the course of the next months that uplift the book. And in any case, if you're interested, you can go to the University of North Carolina Press. We'll put a link into this program, and you can purchase the book, which we've seen. It's really, really essential reading to understand the ways in which other organizations were influenced by them in the earlier part of the 60s, struggling both in Monroe, North Carolina, but in a global sense, representing Black liberation as as they were exiled through the tenacity and the willingness of the FBI to basically set them up, and were embraced by initially Cuba and later China as an act of solidarity with the Black struggle in the United States.
Yeah, it's amazing. Awesome. Nathaniel, you want to talk a little bit about the Puerto Rico doc?
I can, albeit a large subject that I will try to take on in little bits. But I just want to say one last piece about the Williams work, that something that I really, Claude mentioned that it had been kind of like a longer journey, and that our work, started in, both with like the clip that y'all saw and has now extended. I mean, there's probably been over 20 years of work with the family, right? And so I think one thing that this just strikes me is this is the type of grounded relational work that I think is exemplifies the when you remove templates and transactional interactions, like this book has to be done at this time and it has to come out in this way, and here's who gets to write it and here's who doesn't. And instead there's more of an organic process where relationships are deepened and certain folks are comfortable, and because they're comfortable, really provide more in terms of narrating their own struggles and providing access to family items and just all these types of things. So this is an example of, I don't know that this project would be possible like in an academic setting. I think it would have taken too long. There would have been too many rigmaroles. But this is the type of work that is possible here because of that deep relation. And so that's really important to me. And I think also when we're thinking about naming earlier, like when we're providing examples, far be it from the Freedom Archives to be like the example of how you do projects, but the tone and the nature and the substance of, how we try to move through projects, I think can be an example to other folks who are doing their own things. Okay, so Puerto Rico. So maybe one way that I'll start talking about this is, we talked about our film COINTELPRO 101. And in that film, it kind of talks about government repression as it related to a couple movements. And, we talk about those movements. We talk about the Puerto Rican independence movement. We talk about Native movements, Black liberation, and I believe the anti-war movement is the fourth that we talk about in that particular film. And one of the things so since we came out with that film, there have been numerous opportunities for us to deepen the knowledge and expand on the perspectives of those featured in that original film. Yes, Chicano movement. Thank you, Claude. And so one of those examples was, as an example, thanks for this, in 2016, our last film, Symbols of Resistance, the idea behind it was started because of and a desire to expand upon the narratives and information in COINTELPRO 101, that there's a whole additional story to tell just about the Chicano movement. And that kind of process led us into making that film with a number of folks who were involved in COINTELPRO 101, and Symbols of Resistance is another film on Vimeo that you can check out that we made. So the Puerto Rico film started with something similar, right? In COINTELPRO 101, all this information about, in fact, how interested the US government was in repressing and annihilating the Puerto Rican independence movement, at least for myself, coming into the Freedom Archives, that was entirely new. I didn't really know much of anything about the Puerto Rican independence movement. And I don't think that I'm probably the only person that that's true for. And so one of the ideas that's kind of been kicking around for years is, how can we amplify that, right? And use that as an opening for more folks to engage, especially given the unique colonial relationship between Puerto Rico and the US. It's not just, it is the US exerting imperial power, but it's in a different form, and it's very close to home, and it's long-standing, and it's in our own hemisphere. And so, and there's been numerous collaborations between the diaspora and the island of Puerto Rico, as well as involvement with all the other movements for liberation during kind of the classical period of movements in the US. So we wanted to kind of deepen that. And we wanted to also come at it in a little bit of a different way. We want to continue being unique and try new things. So one of the ways that we thought to kind of delve deeper into this is to think about the voices that have been unheard, and the numerous political prisoners that came from that movement, is something where many people know their names. Some folks who are in solidarity with them know more than their names, but in terms of the larger movement painting that happens, these folks oftentimes, get left out of that. And so we wanted to focus on the stories and narratives of folks who were incarcerated for their actions in the Puerto Rican independence movement. And by doing that, open up both larger information about the colonial relationship of Puerto Rico and get people thinking about that, especially in a period where more and more people are interested in learning more about Puerto Rico, and that there has been a huge uptick of advocacy and resistance on the island. We wanted to talk about the issues in a way that doesn't posit statehood versus colonialism, and instead recognizes that there are huge political forces who don't even participate in elections in Puerto Rico because statehood is the only option, and that option is not a viable political option to them. And so we wanted to kind of think about how can we kind of deepen this conversation. And we also wanted to think about, and this is also, something we want to focus on, there's a centrality of imprisonment as a way to repress and break movements, and we want to make that clear. But there's also a centrality of leadership and political action and theory that comes out of prisons and political prisoners that also sometimes gets marginalized, with the idea that the spokespeople on the streets are the leaders and the people that we should pay attention to. And oftentimes folks who are inside, who are having just as much of a robust impact on the movements and have sacrificed so much because they are now incarcerated because of their actions, and again, oftentimes left out. So our goal is to kind of try to take all of those things, which in of themselves are large things, and kind of try to, using the narratives of those people as kind of guideposts, how do we tell this story of Puerto Rican independence, the period of time between the Nationalist Party, which we heard some audio from in that clip, and then in the 90s, a number of folks got their sentences commuted by President Clinton, and there was a huge decarceration. So we want to focus on kind of the period between the Nationalists and the decarceration in the 90s, and kind of lift up what was happening both in the diaspora and on the island. So again, that's a lot. And as we're working on this project, we're trying to kind of figure out ways to best tell that story and to narrow that down a little bit. But one thing that's been so wonderful is we've already gotten to interview, I believe, over 20 people, the majority of which were former political prisoners, and all of whom were active in the Puerto Rican movement. And so that's going to kind of be, those interviews are going to kind of be the grounding, which then the film kind of springs from.
That's great. It brings to mind another question, and we can kind of open up. So audience, if you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat as well. But, thinking about the projects that you all have done, and I guess in particular, thinking about, documentaries or making film, or even, Claude, I know you did radio for a number of years, as we talked about earlier. Like, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot that doesn't make it into the final product. And so I guess one question is, do those items then remain a part of the archive, I'm sure, in some capacity? But, what is a little bit of that process like, of kind of trying to make decisions, trying to figure out, okay, we want to do this in 90 minutes or an hour or whatever you set as a time frame that you want to do it in. And, what's the story that we want to tell? I mean, you just kind of walked us through one example, but I'm just curious, of having several years of doing this kind of work and approaching different projects, what you've kind of evolved as your own working process around these things.
Well, fortunately, back in the day when people actually used DVDs, there was a concept called extras, and those extras from COINTELPRO, for example, from the COINTELPRO 101, which are some of the material that we opened with Geronimo Gijaga, for example, was part of an extra on that DVD that also lives on our Vimeo. So for someone who wants to, increase their knowledge about Geronimo Gijaga, you can do that. And we have to figure out what the modern version of that looks like. We didn't do that with symbols of resistance, but there are a lot of materials that end up being more raw, which doesn't mean that they aren't concise, but it means that there's a relationship between longer pieces with individuals to a product, if you want to call it that, an edited story, a narrative that is more focused around a subject matter. So by poking around either on our website, particularly on our search site, and our Vimeo page and Bandcamp, there's really a richness of material that, while you might want to start in one point, you can allow your own curiosity, your own political focus to determine how you travel through a much larger body of material. And of course, anybody who does research, as Noah knows, once you establish a relationship to us, it opens up even more resources if you can, get to us in person, or at least communicate, what your needs are. So in that process, we contribute to other people's work. We want to see repurposing. We want to encourage the richness of all of this material to exist, not just because we're going to create a product called a documentary, but and the many years of radio work that we did are reflected in the fact that material chronicles years through news programs, through magazine formatted stuff that happened decades ago, and remains a very significant kind of documentation of movements more generally. And it's very fortunate that stuff still has a life. And to some extent, that's true in other places. But the richness of what the Freedom Archives can contribute is because, of that body of work of people that were doing this on a weekly basis, much like this podcast can play that role at some point. But every week for us on the air was a mini documentary. When we created a format in which starts out in the early 70s as The Real Dragon, every week we produced a program that was not necessarily linear, but an amassing of material that came together that included music, poetry, and news, that led people through what, to our thinking, was a week's worth of material reflecting, a movement. And so from the very beginning, one of my mentors, made it very clear from the beginning of my learning how to do radio at all and sound is, first of all, the truth is always left of center, I was told, on a regular basis. I still embrace that concept. The actual truth is left of center, much more left than what an NPR or a PBS would care to characterize. And, that's because of subjugated history and the intentionality of silencing opposition. And, we're seeing that on steroids today And we're seeing the violence that accompanies that. So there's a relationship between the brutality and the genocide in Gaza and the politics of erasure, literally, in this case, where human life is not valued, to understanding what resistance looks like in the face of that, under whatever name it tends to create itself. And our job is to uplift it and to give it legitimacy and to give it support. Because in fact, the values that are represented by revolutionary struggles in any given period are far more humane than the people who hold power. And so we have to make decisions about what side we're on. We're either part of the problem or part of the solution, as the Panthers used to say. And that's a choice. That's a human choice. It's an individual choice and it's a collective choice. And so where we line up is part of today's challenge.
Very important words. Thank you. So an audience question came up, and it's something that I meant to ask anyways, and we should get to this before we go any further. People want to know how they can help. So let's talk a little bit about just different ways. I mean, there's financial support, which I want you all to name, and we can talk. Like, I can pull up the website, show people where to go for that. But what other ways can people, get involved at, I mean, yeah, just talk about that.
Sure. I'll just run through a couple. For folks, one thing that people can do is when we're in community, especially with our elders, and there comes a time when they are thinking about what to do with their materials that they have amassed, it doesn't have to be Freedom Archives, but consider what might be donating to a radical space or a progressive space, so those narratives can be preserved and out there. So one way that you can help this journal project is by making sure that the voices of resistance make their way into archives and that gets put into the historical record. Another thing that you can do is, of course, you can support us. One thing that we're trying to think more deeply about is how we can get monthly sustainers. I don't have to tell anybody on this program that certainly the work that we do is no longer going to be financially appreciated by state and foundations for the next period of time. So yes, and also our model has always been, if we have a strong community of people who give a little, then we'll be just fine. And actually that model has sustained us for the 25 years. It blows my mind, but as someone who's been here for a lot of that time, that is true. And so if any folks just want to become monthly sustainers or make donations, that's super helpful. Another way that you can help us out is, of course, spread the word about using our materials, where the types of work we have talked about on the show today is genuinely the type of work we do on a week-to-week basis. So if you think that intersects with some work that y'all are doing, please do contact us and let us know. We're happy to try to be helpful, and perhaps there's collaborations. I'll stop talking, and there may be other ways that folks can support us.
Right on. I just wanted to share with folks, like, all I did to get this was just Google like Vimeo Freedom Archives and came up with your Vimeo page. I'm sure if I do, Freedom Archives Bandcamp, the same thing comes up. And then on your website also is a search engine that basically lists digitized documents that you can then access, and then it will also sometimes, maybe always, but it tells you also there's non-digitized materials, which would be stuff that's present in the Freedom Archives. I guess that's the other question I would have too, is for people that are in the Bay Area, how, what is that? Do they just stop by? Like, what does the process look like for that?
thanks for asking. As much as we love to have visitors, maybe perhaps call or email before you just come by. And the main reason would just be that there's so few of us, and it is easy for us to get sucked into all the things we're doing. And again, one of the things that we really appreciate is when folks come through, we really want to like engage with them and actually make sure that they can get what they need and all this stuff. So also on the website, under one of those tabs, schedule a research appointment is one of the options. All we would ask you to do is fill out a very short form. We would ask you to take a look at the search site and let us know generally what you are looking for. So it doesn't have to be every single specific item, but at least it could be like some of the collections that you're interested in looking at. Again, just for sake of making it easy for all of us. And then let us know what days you're trying to come in. A staff member sees that form. We take a look at the calendar and we try to propose some days that are close to the ones that you suggested and also works with our schedule. If you just want to email us for something that is not necessarily a research or a research inquiry or an appointment, you can reach us at info@freedomarchives.org. And again, feel free to reach out. Another thing folks can do is if you're connected to institutions, don't hesitate to have those institutions buy our materials. We're in many libraries across the country. Libraries do still buy DVDs. Maybe for the next couple years they do until they're gone. So like those are just some ways to help us. But in general, just spreading the word. And I think the most important thing is to engage the materials. That ultimately, if we lived in a changed society, this work would be easier for all of us. So I think the bigger piece is we're trying to all, stress the emphatic and urgent need for change right now.
Right on. And also I loved the shout out to DVDs, and the extras, and made me think also of enhanced CDs. Does anybody remember those? All right. Couple other questions coming in from folks. So someone asked, how do you handle the tension between the collective focus of Freedom Archives and the archival principles of individual ownership and provenance, which traditionally dictate the way archives are organized and described? I'm sure that you all have a great response to this. And yeah.
I'll take this one and then I'll stop talking for the next question. Yes, so generally speaking, if you go to most archival institutions, like you would use essentially the name of the donor, essentially, and that would lead you to that collection. And the challenge with that is if you don't know who the donor is, or you don't know the name, like the name of the donor doesn't mean anything to you, sometimes actually finding anything can be very, very difficult. And that especially doesn't work well in movement spaces where oftentimes it's not a singular individual or effort that creates something. It might be a collective that's named, or it could be a collective that is unnamed. And so what we do at Freedom Archives, period. And also we want to make things easy to access. And again, a list of names of people with collections is not easy to access. Pictures of things, keywords, subject terms, those make things easier to access. So the way that we catalog our materials is we still have collections, we still are very, very organized, but we don't focus on the name of the person who gave it to us unless that is their explicit desire, of which very rarely is it in our case. And so our materials are generally arranged topically. And then by exploring different topics, you will make your way to different organizations, you will make your ways to different people, and can kind of explore like that. The other thing about our search site and the way in which we kind of arrange our materials and facilitate access to them is you can type in proper searches, which will bring up proper sets of results, or you can literally just click on things and use the clicking and the image derived movement through the site to find things. And that also, again, enables someone to find something when they don't know what they're looking for, which oftentimes, again, like for all people who come to the archives with more questions than answers, we might not know exactly what we're looking for. So sometimes being able to engage the materials in that method actually is an improved, in our opinion, an improved way of access than some of what we see in other settings. So that's generally how we go about it. That doesn't mean that every now and then there's not like a singular collection that has like a singular person's name on it. Sometimes that does happen, but the vast amount of majorities in the Freedom Archives will be topically arranged.
Yeah, right on. I was going to ask a question about the well, one question I had is about, creating, when you create a documentary in particular, but even some of the collections that you create on the website, what are your highest aspirations / what are cool ways that you have seen organizations engage those materials? Because I know as you're creating them, you're not just thinking like, I want to create a cool movie about the Puerto Rican independence movement. Obviously, you care about that, but like, there's a little bit of a deeper meaning too, in terms of, as you've said, trying to, make some kind of intervention, sometimes in history, what's going on in the world, what do we want people to be aware of, why is this history important to movements? And so there's a other side of that too, which is your materials get used in spaces. And I think that's something really particularly, I would hope our audience is kind of trying to think about all the time, is like, political education within organizations and stuff like that. Sometimes that can be really hard because nobody has a lot of time for it. It's not, people are trying to figure out what they're going to do. And so figuring out how to maximize those moments, I think, for organizations is also something that they're always thinking about of, okay, we want to deepen the knowledge of our cadre or the people we're working with. But we want something that's going to be attention grabbing, that's going to, so anyway, I guess the question is just, what are cool ways that you have seen people use this, or what would you love to see? Maybe Claude, yeah.
So sitting behind you, Jared, is the Vinyl Project. So what is that? Well, first of all, it's literally vinyl, if you want it that way. So talk about retro. You can get it as a CD if that's the route you want to take, and you can download it on Bandcamp. Okay, what is it? Early on, probably our first crew of volunteers and interns at the archive, the idea that they came up with was, there's such cool stuff. How do we showcase that? And there's a lot of people who are looking to put political content into the cultural expressions that are emerging. And so people who are DJing or sampling, how do we create a vehicle for that so that we're not determining what it sounds like, we're only adding to context. So it's close to 80 very brief selects of audio that was chosen by people who were new to the material historically, making decisions about how to exert that sound and create a tool that could be utilized in order to infuse, people's creative and cultural side with content. And at least initially, after that got released, we were getting an amazing amount of cultural product from people in, you name the genre. I mean, it was like all over the place. And people were, in fact, infusing their own creative process with material that became available to them because of the Vinyl Project. So that was our way of saying, hey, check this out. there's some amazing stuff that can make people think while at the same time they're, participating in a cultural thing. So in a way, that's an answer. I don't think it's the only answer, but it was an early piece of work that is still, you can still utilize that. And a lot of people did. And so, we've got somewhere we have a box or two of things that were sent to us by people who were doing that. That's a form of support, because in doing that, I mean, it's not financial. It's about, hey, this material can live in different ways and speak to people in different ways and in a variety of contexts, so whether doesn't matter what you call your cultural expression, but it can also be, connected to the history of struggle.
Right on. When people do that, how do you expect, or how do you suggest that should they cite you and but then it's kind of free use? I mean, how do you think about kind of, we've already talked about proprietary stuff sometimes, but we're in Google and YouTube world and they're like, hey, it's copyright and all that kind of stuff. So what is your thinking around that?
I think attribution. Tell people, if you're going to do it, tell us and tell other people where you're getting this stuff.
Yeah. That's great. All right, there's a couple other questions we can go through these quickly. One, this one should be relatively quick to answer, but just give us an idea of how far back your archive materials go in terms of the resistance or freedom movements that you're documenting.
Please, Noah.
Yeah, I can be brief. Just focus mainly on the 1960s through the 1990s. So we have some stuff that might go a little bit before that, but by and large, it's mainly early mid 60s through the 90s.
Yeah. All right. And what do you think are the ways that the archival profession prevents revolutionary or aspiring revolutionary archivists to do the work? Specific practices in the field or structural barriers?
I know who asked that question. Cool. Thanks for the question. I mean, I'm going to say something and then maybe Noah wants to offer something from his perspective, but I think similarly to people who are being trained to do something, I'd say that the archival training that most people get focuses on rules, regulations. There's one way to do something. There's two sides to everything. There's a specific way to do every single thing and you have to do it that way. The language is oftentimes, grounded in colonial relationships and ways of knowing. So, I mean, I'd say that one of the number one things that I see is the way in which archival professionals or people are trained is one of the number one problems. But then that training, is reflected on the job. So at the Freedom Archives, where we push ourselves to make things political decisions and to draw upon collective analysis to think about things. In most archival settings, it's actually outside of here, it's pretty isolated. So it's hierarchical people on a hierarchy who are, because of their roles, told that they get to make certain decisions, and that generally speaking, they should make those decisions in a vacuum. And generally, once a donor gives something, that's the end of it. The donor gives the stuff, and then it's I don't really want to hear from the donor anymore. And again, all of these things are things that we don't do. So those are just some brief things that I think about. But the reason why I'm thinking about Noah, and this is not to put him or you on the spot to answer, but I'm thinking about all the conversations we have around someone who's being trained in a discipline, and the ways in which sometimes that training overlaps to what we're seeing in the Freedom Archives, and in sometimes way that contradicts what we see in the Freedom Archives, and how we have to negotiate, those challenges or tensions.
Yeah, I agree, Nathaniel. I think I don't know. I can only speak kind of from models I've seen that have worked well, and also just how I approach things in my life, where it's like I recognize being trained as a scholar is like a job, right? And like ultimately, like with its various sorts of like constraints and contradictions and limitations, similar to how working in the nonprofit space, as Jared can speak to, right, is filled with various contradictions that inform or limit, your ability to engage in your political commitments. And so, I think what's generally the way I kind of approach it is that I have my political commitments that supersede or transcend my commitments as as a researcher, as a scholar in training, what have you. And obviously, my research commitments or my research is related to questions I'm thinking about in my organizing. Um, but ultimately, like, I don't try to think about the work that I'm doing specifically in the field or in the profession as being revolutionary, radical, or what have you, right? Like, I'm very clear that like my political commitments are what they are. If my my intellectual commitments happen to be in alignment, cool. But I'm not trying to get hung up on like, oh, I'm gonna be Walter Rodney or whatever. Like I don't feel like those particular things or expectations are particularly realistic, right? So it's like focusing on if you're a part of a political organization and you have a political home, what are the expectations and responsibilities for you based on the skills you have? So whether it's you're an archivist, whether it is you're an academic or work in nonprofit space, whatever it is, right? Like how do you leverage those skills into the organizing you're doing? And to upholding your political commitments. So that's kind of how I try to think about it, in less of the being a revolutionary academic, or like I don't necessarily like buy those things. I think you can be a revolutionary who happens to be an academic, right, but not really the like other way around, or both. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks. I want to ask one more question before we get out of here, and then I'll give you guys a space to say any last things that you want to shout out or whatever, and then we'll play the last clip we have. But there's this interesting story that relates to archives, and it came up in one of the notes we were sharing back and forth as we were talking about doing this episode, and it has to do with counterinsurgency and archives and so on. But there's tapes that were recorded from the IRA, from members of the provisional IRA, that ended up going to Boston University, I believe. And then these tapes eventually, because there was a legal case in Ireland and some advocacy around them, I guess they got released. And then this ends up being the body of material that the book and Hulu series Say Nothing is based upon. And I was really just curious to ask, because you all had put that in the notes around one of the questions, of what you all kind of make or think about that, that this happened. And obviously it's a specific example of an institutional archive, and there were also tapes that were supposed to be, I believe, kept sealed until maybe everyone had passed on, something like that, but that didn't end up happening. So anyways, I didn't know if any of you had any reflections on this specific history, but I thought it was an interesting sort of problem for you all to think about in terms of the work that you all do.
I mean, I'll say something very general, and which is something that we're very self-conscious about, not functioning like large institutions, and the conservative nature of large institutions, whether they're endowed or not. This is true of public universities as well as elite schools. We can see, particularly in a period like this, when the challenges to the universities internally are driven by movements that are demanding a severance between the institution and the acts of war that take place, whether it be around Palestine or something else, and then the response of the institutions to those demands to acquiesce is the mildest form, if not enjoin the larger interests of the state in destroying essentially any kind of progressive struggle. And it's an interesting period, so that, you know, whether Harvard does this or that, or Columbia does this or that, what's clear is that they're part of a punitive process that is part of a state agenda of somehow, at the very least, canceling, if not destroying, the lives and careers of people who disagree. And they cling on to, in a lot of cases, it doesn't have to be this way, they cling on to their relationships to research funds that serve the interests of a larger military political strategy of repression. And that's global, and it also has to do with domestic policing. Both are colonial in nature. And so when you look at the way that information is handled by those same institutions, it's not surprising when, in fact, they're part of an appropriative process, whether it's indigenous remains that are kept for decades and centuries, or the way that they function to create barriers of access to the information that they hold. It's all part of a continuum. Any one institution, that can be a point of struggle within it. But certainly in my lifetime, having come up through the demand for a real transition in terms of what education looks like, what its content is, and who has access. I mean, the struggles for ethnic studies, whether it be at San Francisco State or anywhere else, but what gets triggered in a period when there's tremendous upsurge of movement in the community is reflected in the demands that an educational process be equally open. So, you know, here we are years later, when, you know, you're sanctioned as an institution if you cling on to your DEI program, when, you know, we're at the point when ethnic studies could potentially no longer be taught with intentionality. It's not surprising that a library is going to function the same way. An archive is going to function within that same agenda and be directed by the administration that is fundamentally opposed to, you know, the teaching of anything around Palestine, clearly, and the sanctions that come with that for those that, you know, are taking an oppositional position in support of Palestine and against Zionism. So, you know, it's an interesting period in which to really address that question. And we're seeing it in its most negative context.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just talking to a professor the other day who was talking to me about her work a little bit, and she's like, well, I don't teach at the Black Studies department anymore because they eliminated the Black Studies department. So now I'm in, I don't remember what it was, but it was, you know, like women's studies or something, you know, and so it just like that is literally happening on a lot of campuses right now. Absolutely. Any other, Nathaniel, did you want to offer anything? Yeah.
Just one, because I think it connects to some of the stuff, to just a couple of pieces we've talked about. So the tapes that we're talking about were done with both sides of the of armed conflict in Ireland. So both right wing as well as the IRA, the left folks, and in the templated way that I don't really find fault with the folks who did the oral histories, because I don't think they were trying to do anything other than preserve the history. But I think the limitation of their foresight was that the institutional barriers that existed to protect the narratives of the people who gave testimony, specifically in this case, that it would be sealed until their deaths, that they imagined that policy was going to essentially legally protect people against the state. And when one of the people passed before the duration of someone's lifetime and essentially led to the opening for those tapes to be unsealed, then a bunch of people caught charges because of essentially things that they talked about on the tapes. So that leads me to think of a couple different things in terms of like the challenges when you have templated structures for going about preserving left history or history that is like ripe to be repressed. So, one is that everything doesn't need to be saved. So I don't think that there is an imagination that Freedom Archives needs to have everything about movements or everything about any given subject matter. And in fact, for things that there is a threat of state action, we would not want to actively archive those things to not intentionally bring attention to something that we're not trying to bring attention to. And then I think the other piece is everything isn't for everybody. So there's also this idea that, maybe those oral histories were important to have for the communities, for the organizations, for family members, but maybe not for Boston University, right? And so I think that those are some of the, and always to me, what this brings us back to is having people who are making archival decisions in this particular sense, who are grounded in the community and in the ideas of what they're trying to do. And I would say that for any archival work. So if someone was trying to do, musical archival work, they should probably know something about the cultural music form that they're trying to archive, or, and the more and more that we can actually infuse the ways in which we're thinking about things into the practice of how we do this, I think that not that issues like that would be avoided, but guaranteed if we were to ask the people who collected those oral histories if they could do it again, would they do it again differently? I'm confident that they'd probably do it again differently, right? And so I think some of it is how to negate the damage that gets done by those, that it's great hindsight to do it differently, but how do we negate that damage from happening? And I think the more and more foresight that we're putting into making these decisions before we do them, that will help protect our movements.
That's a great answer. All right. Anything any of you want to say just in closing? I mean, I just encourage people to check out the website, go to the donate page, become a monthly sustainer, do all of those things. Check out the Vimeo page, the Bandcamp. And again, I'll put all the specific clips in the show description as well as the general pages right after we close this. Anything any of you want to say? Thank you so much for this conversation today.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
And I just want to say there's a lot of love for you all in the chat right now too. So much appreciation from the audience as well. This has been great. All right, so I'm going to leave us with a final clip from Geronimo Gijaga, and we will get out of here on that note here.
Cool. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
I always try to encourage people to wake up, because when you see me 27 years later, that you come up to me and you ask me for an autograph. And I love you for your sentiment, but it tells me that you don't know who I am. I'm not a movie star. You said, I don't mean to hurt your feelings. It happens everywhere I go that I did not join a movement to sign autographs. I did not join the movement to become world renowned for fortune or fame or for your money or for anything. I joined a movement to win. We cannot promote ourselves. We can only promote the revolution, the struggle. I'm trying to tell you how we look at it. With Mumia sitting up there on death row, he understands when he joined, just like we all did, that we were going to go to prison, that we were going to be driven underground, that we were going to be killed, that we were going to be exiled, because we knew the nature of our enemy. And if you think anything other, you are playing a dangerous game, because we are faced with a very vicious enemy.